We have multiple arenas of leadership challenges to test and train leadership capability. They're all different arenas you can go to. The two that I'm going to talk about the most, because they probably had the most power, was the land warfare arena and then the Mount or Sauk arena. And this is another thing that they changed at some point. It used to be Mount when I was younger, which was military operations, urban terrain, and then it got changed to Sauk, which is special operations, urban combat. But whatever you want to call it, these two arenas that we were allowed to run these training missions, and had the opportunity to platoon after platoon after platoon after platoon through complex, dynamic, reactive, intense, realistic, high-pressure scenarios where the difference between success and failure came down to one thing and one thing only. It only came down to one thing, and that was leadership. That was leadership. It was 100% leadership. If a platoon or a task unit was successful, it was because of leadership. And if the platoon or task unit failed, it was because of leadership. Because there's some constants. There's some variables and some constants. The constants are, look, you're going to be in a stressful situation. It's going to be a complex mission. It's going to be a opposing force. So the bad guys are going to be highly capable. They're also going to be tightly controlled most of the time. Sometimes my brothers would get a little out of hand, but most of the time it's tightly controlled. And then you have a platoon or two platoons of SEALs. Now, some people might think, well, there's going to be a variation in the SEAL platoons. And that is accurate. There is going to be some level of variation of the skills in a SEAL platoon. But overall, the variation of the troops, of the 14 or 16 shooters in that platoon, overall, when you combine them all together, you're going to have some smart guys, you're going to have some dumb guys, you're going to have some old guys, you're going to have some new guys, you're going to have some aggressive guys, you're going to have some passive guys, you're going to have all these different, big guys, small guys, you're going to have all these different guys, and you take them all together and you mix them up, and that platoon is going to fall within the margin of error of a normal SEAL platoon. That's what's going to happen. SEALs come in all different shapes and sizes, and that's just the net outcome that you get when you put them all together is a SEAL platoon, and they're all kind of pretty much the same thing. Look, there's a variance, like I said, there's a variance, but there's not one platoon that's filled with idiots. It just doesn't exist. There's not one platoon that's filled with everyone's a stud. It doesn't exist. Occasionally we get these stacked platoons occasionally, and sometimes they'd implode and sometimes they'd be good because, again, you got the mixture. But what would happen in a stacked platoon just depends on how good the leader was. If the leader could contain those egos, that platoon could be great. If he couldn't, it would fall apart. So because the platoon is kind of the same functional thing within a margin of error, the only difference between success and failure ends up being the platoon leadership. And it doesn't really even matter where that platoon leadership is coming from. It doesn't really even matter. It probably took me 1 month to figure this out. It took me 1 month before I didn't care who the leader was. I didn't care if it was the chief. I didn't care if it was the platoon commander. I didn't care if it was the leading petty officer of the platoon. I didn't care if it was an E5, 3 E5s that were just awesome and they could make shit happen. That's enough leadership in a platoon that they can win all day. I would say, no, when I took over TRADET,
yes,
I was watching, and at first I thought, hey, here's the job for the OIC.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Here's the job for the platoon chief. Here's the job for the assistant platoon commander. Here's the job for the LPO. Hey, these are the roles and responsibilities. I wrote those roles and responsibilities out and gave them to people and issued them to people, and they were like, okay, this is cool. But then you'd realize you'd have a platoon chief that didn't know what he was doing, or you'd have an OIC that didn't know what he was doing. And so he couldn't handle that job, whatever that job was.
Yes.
But if you had a horrible platoon chief, but the LPO was a badass, it wouldn't really matter. That guy would just cover for him and make it happen. And maybe the chief is good at admin. And so he's kind of, oh, look, man, I'll take care of the paperwork over here. You got to do your thing. I mean, it's not like Leif Babin was relying heavily on Tony Afrati to handle the paperwork for Leif, right? I bet you Tony didn't know how to turn on a computer, right? because that's not what his skill set was. And it didn't matter one bit. Leif's doing paperwork, his junior officer doing paperwork, Tony's running tactics like Tony should be running tactics. But that can swap.
Yes.
That can swap. You can end up with a platoon commander who's just a stud and has a good comprehension of tactics, and a platoon chief that doesn't really get it. He's a good guy, but he's not going to add much from the tactical front. But so that's what it boils down to. It took me about a month to go, look, I don't care. As long as we have leaders in here, I'm happy. And so going through this training, the training that we had not only identified who the leaders were and then what their shortfalls were, but most important, it allowed us the opportunity to teach them how to lead.